If you watched my video on how I use isotope to acquire artist EQ for tones, that was kind of a ballpark starting point. And sometimes it works great, and sometimes it just doesn't. In this video, I am going to take you through the process of how I dial in tones in Tone Studio from start to finish. And when I started doing these tones, it was to help people learn how to dial them in themselves, not just watch me and download the patch and then go from there. My hopes were that people would watch me, figure out how I dial in these tones, what each aspect of this does, and how they can do it themselves, being self-sufficient and learn how to use this amp better for themselves. But there are people that just want to download and go, and I can understand that because it is very time consuming sometimes. As this channel grows, time becomes a little bit shorter, and the tones I do for Katana or whatever are going to be fewer and far between because I just don't have the time for it. I've got gear I've got to review that I request, and that's another part of that whole partnership thing was they don't send me the gear that they want me to review. I request gear that I want to review. So it's always on me, and there's no contractual obligation for me to, say what they want me to say. I can do whatever I want as long as it's within a respectable tone. And I'm not saying some stupid stuff. So I'll give honest reviews of that stuff, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about tones. So let's get started. Let's open up Tone Studio and get going with it. When I start working on a tone, I try to do a little research to help me along the way. I'll do some Googling to see if there's articles out there on the artists for that particular recording session. And I also use Equipboard to look at what gear they have used from past to present, what kind of guitar they may have used, effects pedals, amps, etc. If you've never used Equipboard, I'll put a link down in the description, and you just put your artist or band in there, and it kind of shows you what gear they use. It's a really helpful thing, and a lot of it's verified. So first thing, when it comes to choosing a guitar, there are a few things I consider. First and foremost, tuning. Most of my guitars are tuned to E standard or E flat, but I have a few that are tuned down for the occasional songs that might require loader tuning, like C, C sharp, or even B. Now, if you're not in the right tune, the tone isn't going to sound right at all. Okay, secondly, does the artist use single coils? Do they use humbuckers? That usually depends on the genre of the tone. Now, lastly, I consider the output of the pickups. Depending on how much gain is in the tone, I may consider something with a lower output if the artist used lower output pickups in guitars such as a Les Paul. And speaking of Les Paul, sometimes I get viewers asking why I don't use a specific guitar or active pickups in a video. I try to take into consideration that not everyone is going to have the same gear, so it really doesn't matter the exact gear that I use. And if I use higher output pickups and all you have is your average output pickups, you just might have to increase the gain on the amp a bit. Now, there is always going to be variables when it comes to tones, gear, room, acoustics, and so on. Then once I've chosen a guitar, I usually try to practice the specific song to be semi-proficient in that basic rhythm with a basic tone, so I have something to go off of when I start dialing things in. And it can be very time consuming. Now, the first thing I do look at is choosing the right device chain. And all this can change when you've gone all through it and you kind of go back and start tweaking little things. So this is just something I consider. I try to get the basic chain going down. And most of the time I'll choose chains like we got 2-2 here where the mod is before the booster, because a lot of the times I put a compressor before the booster, and the booster is always before the amp. But there are occasions where I might use one of these here where I got an FX before the amplifier, maybe a chorus or a 10-band equalizer. But most of the time I start out with 2-2 just because it's a good starting point in my opinion. Next, I choose the amp settings. Now, if I go to Equipboard and they're using like a Marshall stack or something, I usually put it on crunch, and if it's distorted, I'll add the booster from there and try to use it as a boost and maybe not quite distortion. Now, if it's more of a rectifier type lead amp, I'll use the lead, and it's pretty self-explanatory. If it's clean, I'll use clean. But a lot of my tones that I'm using distortion on, I will put it on crunch, and I will adjust the gain right to the point of breakup. And then I'll use something like a tube screamer to adjust that boost. And a lot of the times it sounds a lot more natural than the lead or the brown channel. Once I've chosen my amp, I'll go through the settings, the gain, the volume, the EQ over here, the cabinet resonance. If it's an old vintage amp, I'll use vintage. If it's more of a modern feel, modern and deep and so on. And then I'll adjust the presence. Once I've got all those kind of figured out now, these things may be adjusted later on, so nothing here is set in stone just yet until I'm completely satisfied with the tone that I'm aiming for. Now, sometimes that can take days as I sit there and practice a song more and more and find little things to adjust and hear how it sounds in a mix. I might make little changes that might make a big difference. But I'm always second guessing myself with these tones anyway. Next, I'll try to dial in the gain. I'll try to dial in the gain right here, and then I'll start shooting for a boost. Choosing the right amp is key to this, and there is some personal preference that comes into play, like I was saying with the lead and the brown. Now, for anything from overdriven to high gain, like I said, I'll choose crunch, push it, and then I'll use an overdrive pedal or the Governor DS or T-Scream or one of the fuzzes to kind of push it to that distorted sound. You'll rarely see me use the lead or the brown because, like I said, they sound a little too compressed sometimes. And the crunch with pedals tends to sound more organic, like a push tube amp. And most overdrive pedals were made to be used on a driven amp anyway. Now, some people prefer the lead and the brown channel. Again, it's a personal preference. And if I can get the tone I'm trying to achieve while using the crunch, then that's what I do. As far as using the clean amp and boosts to achieve distortion, you can use a clean amp with some of the distortion pedals like the metal zone or the heavy metal or metalcore, and sometimes that's the best option for certain boosts. Now, once I think I've gotten the right amp and boost combo, I'll make the adjustments with the boost EQ, even play with the mix. Now, the direct mix down here, depending on what pedal you use, can make a huge difference. Sometimes it can make it sound much fatter, and sometimes it can make it really muddier. So play around with that one. Don't be afraid to play with that one right there. Now, once you've gotten your basic amp and boost dialed in, then comes the fun part. Okay, trying to figure out all of the other dynamics of the tone. Does it need a compressor or even a limiter to boost it even more to even things out a bit? Now, if I feel like it just needs a bit of sustain or attack, but I don't want too much over manipulated tone or to dull it down a bit, I'll use a light compressor. The other effects and mods can be a bit tricky, especially if you're not familiar with using them. Chorus is very easy to overdo, and a little too much can almost sound like a phase. And sometimes a phase can sound a little like a flanger, and sometimes a flanger can sound a little like a phaser. So you got to be able to differentiate those. And a lot of the time you can go on YouTube or sit there and just turn one on, and not so much phase and chorus, but phase and flanger. You can kind of get a little confused. So play with those a bit. They're great effects, but keep playing with it and it'll start coming natural to you. It's like a muscle memory. Now, delay and reverb are two that can be a bit confusing when it comes to getting the right type. And sometimes you have to play with them to figure it out. And sometimes you got to figure out, do I need a delay and a reverb, or do I need just reverb, or do I just need delay, and so on and so forth. But once you start working with it a lot more, like I said, it kind of becomes muscle memory, and you figure it out, and you figure out what you need and you don't need. Now, this is also where the research and equip board come in handy when trying to figure out the effects used by an artist. Now, contour, you got the contour switch up here, and you got the adjustments down here. Now, the defaults have 3 different defaults on here for it. It's adjusting mids within your tone. So if you want something that's real quick on the fly, you can just use this defaults, or you can play with it over here and you can make your own custom contours and change the frequency shifts all up. That is up to you. I should probably back up a little bit. When I start dialing the amp and the boost over here, okay, you want to come over here to your noise suppressor. If you're getting a lot of noise, test it with the amp. If you're using headphones, unplug them. Test it with the amp in a room and see how it sounds if you need the noise suppressor and if you don't. and then adjust the threshold and the release. Sometimes there can be a fine line between too much and too little. And if you got too much, it's going to dampen your tone, and it's going to ruin it. It's not going to quite sound right, and you're not going to get the release and the sustain you want within some of the effects or the tone itself. So play with that before you get too deep into things, and just if you can just kind of roll them back as you're playing along, and just finding that sweet spot where it suppresses the noise and it doesn't kill your tone. Back over to EQ now. EQ is an entirely different animal, and sometimes you just have to use your ear, and it takes a lot of practice and understanding the frequencies, or at least the basics. And if you're playing with the EQ and you think if you found the tone you want, write it to a channel and then write it to the live set and name it like 1, 2, 3. But every time you make a change, save it, because it's very easy in EQ, working with a parametric EQ or even the graphic equalizer, to make a change and you're like, damn, what was that last tone I had? That sounded the best. And sometimes it's not always easy to rewind and find exactly what you had last time. So if you think you found a good tone, save it, move on, keep tweaking it, save it, tweak, save, tweak. That's the best way to do it. I prefer using the amp out, but always play with that amp in or amp out. And I prefer the parametric equalizer because I think it lets you fine tune things and lets you round your tone out, make it sound more fatter, and give it more body and volume to it. So it's like basically your volumizing conditioner for your tone, not your hair. So stupid analogy, I know. But play with that, get used to it. Also, play with your graphic equalizers. I mean, a lot of the time, this right here, you're not going to hear a big difference in the 8 and 16s. Sometimes you might hear a little twanginess more with the 16, but you start with the lows. You're not going to need a whole lot of lows in there because that's what your bass guitar is for. But if you're just playing by yourself in your room and you need the lows, you can dial some in there, and then your mids and then your highs. But play around and just play with EQ. EQ is fun. It can make your tone sound so much better. And the more you play with it, the more proficient you get at it. Last thing, save, save, save. As I was trying to reiterate before, save your tones, come back to them. Just create a live set for that tone that you're trying to achieve. Because once you think you got it, play with it in a mix, see how it sounds, and then make your adjustments. And you'll find yourself second guessing yourself and making these adjustments more and more. But the more you do it, like I said, the better you get at it. You know, practice makes perfect. You may not always get it perfect. You may not be able to get it perfect. But you'll come damn close, and you won't need other people doing your tones for you. And that is a wonderful thing. So I hope this video has been helpful and kind of gets you on the right path to making your own tones and figuring out how you can do it. Look back at a lot of my old tones. Go check out Mason V's on Synthedelic. Watch him dial in his tones. Him and I sometimes do things a lot differently, and we achieve different tones. And I think some of mine sound great and some of mine sound terrible. I look at old tones and I'm like, man, that really doesn't sound all that great. But then some of my other tones I'm very proud of. Either way, I'm just trying to help. And like I said, tones are going to be a little few and far between from now on. So try to be self-sufficient. That is one thing in life that you need to do, whether it's tones or whatever. Try to be self-sufficient because not everybody can do everything for you. I think I've kind of gone off course from guitar tones into some life analogy bullshit that I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about. I'm really not. But thanks for watching. Hit that like button if you're not a subscriber. Subscribe for more content, and we'll see you next time.